Here is another natural radiation forcing that can cause climate change. I mentioned briefly in the Little Ice Age when we looked at the Holocene temperature record that Little Ice Age had something to do with sunspots, right? The trick here is to remember that sunspots are basically kind of magnetic storms on the sun, which leave dark spots, but around them you get these faculae which are very bright. They're also called plage. You can see here. So it turns out that the more the sunspots, higher the radiation coming from the sun. So even though there are dark spots around them, more radiation is produced, which means fewer number of sunspots actually means less energy. So more sunspots, more energy, less sunspots, less energy. Little Ice Age is one example where sunspot activity contributed to a global cooling, although evidence is that it probably was a local cooling over parts of the northern hemisphere. No strong evidence for it in the southern hemisphere or deep into the tropics. So it is the variable energy from the sun over time that can cause climate change, obviously, if you receive different amounts of energy. So sun's luminosity is affected by sunspots. There are cooler episodic dark areas on the sun. They have a 11-year cycle and then other longer time scale minima and maxima. Not everything is understood, even though now solar physics is understood a lot more. Faculae, the sunspots. This I'm mentioning because it has been used to be at least brought up a lot that sunspots are causing global warming. So you can see here that the temperature is actually warming more monotonically in the last 40 years or so that we saw since the 80s. Each decade has been warmer than the previous decade, even though the interannual variability is fairly obvious here in the yellow color. And the sun's activity in terms of the total solar irradiance is shown here in terms of year-to-year variability or multi-year variability and a average over the 11-year cycle. So you can see that that also has gone up and down, but has had a increase in incoming energy by a few watts per meter squared over the 20th century, and now it has flattened or going down. So this increase in sunspot activity was used to claim that sunspot activities can cause global warming. But now we know exactly the amount of warming that's happened and continues to happen. And we know the greenhouse effects involved by the greenhouse gases emitted by human activities. And we know very well the measurements of sunspot activity and solar radiation. And we can say confidently that sunspot activity is not a big player. It's not causative of global warming. We'll come back to this a little bit later on, more also in terms of the Little Ice Age. So we are not denying that sunspot activity is part of the cycle. For example, there is arguably a sunspot kind of cycle in the monsoon. Okay, some people have taken a more than 100-year long time series of monsoon rainfall each year, and they have shown that there is a signal in it that corresponds to the sunspot activity. Sunspot activity has an 11-year cycle. It has a particular structure, a butterfly structure it's called, starting at higher latitudes on the sun. So sun also has an equator and meridional and zonal directions. So it increases from the higher latitudes and comes down to the equator and then goes back and so on. I won't show a figure, but just imagine that the solar models can reproduce this, and we know something about where this kind of time scale may come from. But without knowing any of that, we can observe it and monitor the changes in the amount of energy coming onto Earth, and we can explain why that might change. For example, the land heating versus the ocean heating, and the temperature gradient, pressure gradient, strength of the monsoon circulation, and the monsoon rainfall. Can be related to the higher latitude changes as well, because that can change the ITCZ movement, moisture supply, and so on. So the physics of it is fairly well known. The main point to remember is that we track very well the sunspot activity, and reconstruction of solar activity now goes back with various evidences to more than a millennium, and we know that it can be a player, but in global warming it is not a causative factor. Sunspot activity does not cause global warming.